basis, modernism was the rejection of European culture for having become too complacent, lethargic, and corrupt. Modern thinkers believed that society was bound by really artificial beliefs and feelings. So they believed that people were too caught up in appearance and image and were afraid of change. Modernism encompasses works of thinkers who rebelled against the 19th century academic traditions, believing that traditional forms of art, literature, architecture, and so on were becoming outdated. Modernist literature was first and foremost a visceral reaction against the Victorian era and their traditions and culture. Intellectuals and artists at the turn of the century believed that the previous generation's way of doing things was a cultural dead end. In the world of art, generally speaking, modernism was the beginning of the distinction between high forms of art and low forms of art. Educational reforms had led to a rapid increase in literacy rates, and the demand for literature of all sorts came to be. Elitist writers who refused to bow to the popular tastes and demands found themselves in a state of alienation from mainstream society. Experimentation with genre and form were the main characteristics of modernist art and are best seen in T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. One characteristic of modernism was its fickleness. Because there were so many scientific discoveries and technological innovations during the time period, the world was changing so quickly all the time that people struggled to keep up. Everyone felt a tremendous creative energy always looming in the background, as if to announce the birth of some scientific discovery or theory that was new. By 1900, there was electricity, the combustion engine, airplanes, automobiles, and light bulbs. So modernism was set in motion by a series of cultural shocks, the first being the Great War.
Notoriously dubbed the war to end all wars, World War I greatly shaped the modern world and began what we now know as the modernist period. The war spanned 4 years, its official dates being July 28, 1914 to November 11, 1918. Though the short amount of time, the damage experienced on all sides was unprecedented. Just as with any other war, the passion of nationalist pride ran strong throughout the country. By September 5, 1914, 225,000 men had willingly signed up to fight. But as the body count rose and blood-stained hands, enlistment began to decrease. By January 1916, the British government introduced forced conscription, which included single men only. When numbers were still not adequately met, the conscription was extended to all men aged 18 to 41 by May of the same year. The technology introduced on both sides was also a shock. New innovations such as gas and tanks were introduced on both sides. Gone were the days of trench combat. These new techniques left men blind, deaf, and disfigured. Airstrikes were also introduced by the Germans in January 1915. 50-plus aerial attacks were executed on the British populace. By the end of the war, there were an estimated 850,000 military deaths. 1,187,450 men returned home with military pensions. The civilian death rate was found to be 292,000 from food shortages, illness, and military actions like the air raids. The economy was nearly in shambles due to inflation doubling. By the end of the war, 40% of Britain's economic budget was reserved exclusively to pay interest on its mountain of debt. Elsewhere in the world, World War I left its share of death and destruction. The Allied forces, which consisted of France, Russia, Italy, Japan, the US, and the United Kingdom, among others, as well as the Axis powers, which was led by Germany, faced post-war difficulties. After the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, which ended the war, the lost generation was spawned. Due to the substantial loss of men, most women were unable to wed. Cynicism and disillusionment grew in the remaining population. Communist ideals grew in popularity across Europe. Nihilist thought process swept across the nation. Yet all was not lost. Eventually, the economy picked up in speed in multiple countries, including the United States and the United Kingdom. This new decade is what we now know as the Golden Age 20s across the pond, or in America, the Roaring 20s. This disillusionment, brought on by World War I, now found its roots among the people. Across the world, people enjoyed the live and let live ideals. Pop culture experienced an unprecedented boom. Art surrealism took hold, and Pablo Picasso rose to fame. Jazz took the world by storm. In 1922, the British Broadcasting Corporation, better known as the BBC, was launched. The field of literature became infamous thanks to The Lost Generation. Members included T.S. Eliot, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Eric Remarque. Authors such as these immortalized the listlessness experienced by all. T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland is still regarded as one of the most important poems of the 20th century, especially for modernist texts.
Despite this, the war did have some good come out of it, such as women gaining the right to vote and the passing of the Representation of the People Act of 1918, which gave equal rights to all men.
It all came to a crashing halt, literally, in 1929, when the U.S. Wall Street stock market crashed. The metaphorical light at the end of the tunnel to the disaster of the Great Depression was none other than the Second World War. Again, the world plummeted into the struggles of war, this time to combat Hitler's Nazi doctrine. Britain and France officially entered World War II on September 3, 1939, 2 days after the German invasion of Poland. The entirety of World War II lasted 6 years, with the official end being September 2, 1945. Within this period of time, multiple operations ensued, as learned during the previous World War. Again, the war brought new technologies. While propaganda has always been used to gain the upper hand, never had it been used on such a large scale. Movie screenings encouraged others at home to support those on the front lines. Posters for victory gardens were a common sight. Yet no form of propaganda was larger than the BBC. Serving as a go-between for the people and for the men of the hour, the BBC of World War II was as close to the action one could get without formally enlisting. A key figure of the war was also Winston Churchill. Elected as the Prime Minister of Britain on May 10th of 1940, Churchill played a major role in orchestrating major war operations, assembling the Allied powers, and becoming the voice of a nation through the BBC radio waves. Around the world, people held their breath as war ensued. As the war slowly came to an end and the Axis powers were pushed back, an audible sigh could be heard on July 23, 1944. On this day, the first concentration camp, Poland's Majdanek, was liberated. On January 27, 1945, the largest and most famous of the concentration camps, Auschwitz, was liberated. The Second World War ended with Germany's surrender on April 29, 1945, and its leader's suicide on April 30, 1945, beside his wife of only 40 hours, Eva Braun, in a joint suicide. The end of the war brought more death than the previous. 16 million soldiers would not find their way back home, and 45 million civilians, Holocaust victims included, would perish.
The postmodernist period was largely in reaction to the assumed certainty of scientific or objective efforts to explain reality. The period lacked the optimism that the modernist period had, that said that there was a scientific, philosophical, or religious truth which would explain everything for everybody. It was marked stylistically and ideologically by reliance on fragmentation, paradox, unreliable narrators, unrealistic plots, paranoia, irony, parody, and dark humor. The postmodern literature tends to reject outright meaning in their novels and poems and instead celebrate and highlight the possibility of multiple meanings and complete lack of meaning sometimes. Postmodern literature often rejects the boundaries between high forms of art and low forms of art and literature, as well as distinction between different genres and forms. Certain techniques seen in postmodern works are metafiction, minimalism, maximalism, reader involvement, faction, pastiche, and temporal distortion. In many ways, postmodernism serves to dispute, reverse, mock, and reject the principles that modernism literature had. For example, Postmodern literature tends not to conclude with the nice tied up little endings found in modern literature, and instead they follow a certain standard of playfulness and lack of meaning to life, and they seem to enjoy and delight in the chaos. While modernist literature has fragmentation and existential crisis that needs to be solved, postmodern literature sees that as something good and something that can't be overcome. They don't see chaos as a bad thing, but instead they love it. A few examples of postmodern literature are The Cannibal by John Hawkes, Naked Lunch by William Burroughs, Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath, and Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut.
In today's modern age, people just look for something completely different. We saw that in modernism there was just no hope after World War I, and World War II basically brought the same thing. So we just wanted a completely different change. And people found that in completely different subcultures. In the 60s, we saw the age of the hippies. The Beatles were brought over to America, and Woodstock happened in 1969. In a time fueled by rock and roll and drugs, we saw a change that went from flower children slowly into, at least in Britain, a scene of punk rock subculture that is highlighted through basically chains and mohawks and leather boots. So basically now today, we don't really know if we're still in a postmodern subculture or what we consider now to be post-postmodernism, but only time can tell.